All right, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thanks for wanting to, thanks for being part of PinotGeeks and for letting us do this. And hopefully this can be something that we can do again in the future. This was all kind of started by a comment that someone made about a video where Doug Schaefer interviewed me, and they were like, we wish that there could be some more in-depth talk about Pinot, really geeky topics, that kind of thing. And thought that this would be a fun way to do that. And so we're going to concentrate on two topics today. We're going to spend about the first half of this. This should last about an hour. The first half of it talking about Pinot Noir clones, and then the second half will be done with a discussion on whole cluster fermentation. At the bottom, and I see Lisa, you've already got using the chat function there. There is the chat function. I certainly welcome comments, questions, that kind of thing. It's probably easier. I mean, we got a number of winemakers on here that are going to be sharing their knowledge. But then if you have questions, want to jump in, do it on the chat function there, I think is probably the easiest way to do so. And we already have a few questions that people posted earlier. So with no further, and then Lisa, you mentioned, is there a way for this to be shared? I am recording this and I have a YouTube channel. I will post something in PinotGeeks, a link to it, and people can go over, and then it'll be available to everybody for as long as you care to do that. So the first thing we'll start talking about is Pinot Noir clones. And I think to lead off with this, we're going to let John Bucher kind of jump in and explain what clones are to all of us. John owns the Bucher Vineyard in the Russian River on West Side Road. So John, take it away for a few minutes.
Great, thanks, Adam. But before we get into that, I just want to acknowledge, I know you worked with him, Adam, the passing of Philippe Cambie Saturday. I don't know if he's was a prominent winemaker in the Chef Nip de Pop, Rhone of France, and you've worked with him. And I had the pleasure of meeting him a couple of years ago at dinner with you and myself and Diane. And I just want to, send my condolences. I know you spoke very, very highly of him, and it was a pleasure to meet him.
Thanks. Yeah, we started that Beaumarchais Pinot project together, and when Philippe told me he'd always dreamed of making Pinot Noir, I think everybody here can relate to that, and so it's really sad that he passed. But thank you, John.
Yeah, you're welcome. So as far as clones and defining what a grape vine clone is, it's without getting into too much of the science, and maybe there's other winemakers or viticulturists that could define it better, but to my knowledge and the way we've described it over the years of in farming grapes, it's basically a mutation, and technically it's a mutation that comes from a single bud on a single vine. So you can get into the weeds a little bit about selections versus clones, but from our discussion here, think of it as a mutation that happens somewhat spontaneously when a plant is propagated, and it's all Pinot Noir, and just like there are Pinot clones, there are also clones in other grape varieties also. Maybe because Pinot is one of the older varietals out there, there's maybe more clones that have been discovered, more mutations, because it's one of the oldest vines grown. As far as longevity or the timeline since the beginning, but it's basically a mutation, and that's different than say a vine that is or something that is crossbred or a cross or a hybrid. That's different. That's when you take two different Venus vinifera, two species of vines, and cross them to get a new type of grape variety. That's different than a clone. That would be like for example, Cab Sauv is a cross between Sauvignon Blanc and Cab Franc. That's a cross. That's not. This is all within the same varietal And they can be good and sometimes not so good as far as these mutations, but usually they manifest themselves in something physical that you see on the vine or in the cluster, the shape of the cluster, size of the berries, elongation or shortness of the cluster. But it also then can also create from those different physical traits. It could be, you could have a different thickness of skin. It could play into how well they grow in certain areas. It could play into retaining acid versus not, adapting to cooler climate. They're all different things that can happen, earlier bud break. But what you see first is really the differences in the physical differences, I think, is where they're probably first identified for the most part. Not always, but for the most part.
So yeah, that's one of the things. I mean, I think as consumers, a lot of times people immediately start to look at or try to identify certain flavors with specific clones. But I think being out in the vineyards, there is more of this clone is smaller, this clone is larger, this clone has thicker skins, that type of thing. That goes on. Nathan, you were mentioning earlier a particular clone, clone 23, and just its cluster morphology and all of that. I know you deal with a few different clones, but I mean, not all of them. I don't know any of us to deal with all of them. But what do you look for or see out in vineyards and differences?
Yeah, well, I'm in the Edna Valley Appalachians, so we're really cool coastal, a lot of fog in the morning through the growing season. And so I mentioned earlier, clone 23 is kind of this strange looking Pinot Noir clone. Instead of being a kind of well-behaved cylindrical, pine cone shaped cluster, it's a little bit rangy and pretty open and loose. But what we found is it's really great in our area where we have so much fog and moisture on the clusters in the morning. It really can dry out pretty well. We never have a lot of rot pressure, bunch rot or anything like that. And it's become our kind of go-to for whole cluster fermentation because of that reason. The clusters stay pretty pristine. I don't find it to be very aromatic relative to other clones of Pinot Noir, and it's not a clone that I see in really high favor everywhere, but it works well in our site.
I do think that the looking at different clones and looking at what they're like, as you said, with an open cluster like that. There's some 23 that I've dealt with down in the San Lucia Highlands, and it's planted down there for similar reasons. More open areas that have a lot of fog. A lot of times in tighter clones, you'll end up with botrytis starting very easily inside the cluster. But with 23, I don't really know that I've seen a cluster with botrytis before.
Kind of shrugs it off.
Yeah.
And one other place where we have employed different clones, when we did a replanting of kind of the front block of the vineyard, we put in 3 clones, 777, 667, and 828. We put the 667 kind of in the middle because we know that it can be subject to a lot of shatter if it has too much wind. And so we wanted a little bit more sheltered in kind of the bowl of that block. And then 828 is known for being a very upright growing clone of Pinot Noir. And we put that right along the driveway where the owners drive up every day so that it'll look all organized and neat. So that was a good trick.
So I will kind of talk briefly here that in larger groups, there are Dijon clones and non-Dijon clones, heritage clones in some cases. The Dijon clones are clones that were isolated at the University of Dijon and then have been propagated around the world. And so the ones that you see mostly out there are 113, 114, 115, 667, 777, and 943 has kind of come out now. Then there are heritage clones, things that have been here in the States for a while, Pomard, Martini, a few other a few other things such as that. And then there are things like 828, which the 828 you talked about being an upright growing clone. 828 is more, it was actually a snuck over, a suitcase clone as they call it. And it was snuck over by Gary Andrus from Archery Summit and Pine Ridge and planted up at Archery Summit. I was there actually when he brought it in. And so there's that. There are things like the Pizzoni Selection, which Gary Pizzoni snuck over from Burgundy. There's just a lot of, I guess, those three broader categories of clones. Then within those, I mean, like John, you grow, I don't remember, how many different clones? 7, 8?
We actually have 10 on 20. We have 10 different Pinot Noir clones on about 20 different Pinot Noir sites on my ranch, and then 2 ranches contiguous to us that we lease. So, so there are multiple, you know, obviously what drives our vineyard is the Pommard clone, which speaking of, you know, we're talking about what traits we see physically, they're usually bigger berries. But what we gravitated towards the Pommard mainly because it holds up well in the warmer climate. We're in the northern part of the Russian River Valley. We are closer to the southern Dry Creek Valley than we are to some other parts of the Russian River. When you get out to like Green Valley and out towards Sebastopol, it's the Russian River AVA is fairly large. So we're in the warmer part, and we found that that the Pommard clone holds up when we get heat. If we get heat right before harvest, especially, it retains the acidity much better than some of the other Dijon clones. So that's you know, even though it's, I don't know if that's the reason, we just kind of gravitate toward that because first of all, winemakers were interested in that clone in our area. So I started planting that, and then as we were harvesting, we would see the difference in how they just they came in at a much better higher or normal acid level than some of the Dijon clones where they fall off. And acid's important in Pinot.
And one of the things I've heard speculation of, and I think there's some truth in this, is the Dijon clones were isolated by the University of Dijon. They were isolated and then chosen to propagate because they were they ripened earlier. In Burgundy, you had difficulty getting things ripe for a long time, so you pick clones there that ripen earlier, that don't retain perhaps as much acidity because they come in at extraordinarily high levels of acid. So it's funny then, we took the clones from the University of Dijon and brought them over here to the United States that were made to work or selected to work in Burgundy, and probably put them in, at least in California, in the climate that wasn't the right climate in some ways necessarily for them.
Well, the interesting thing when we first, and you're absolutely right, there are parts of California and I think in Oregon where the Dijon clone works much better relative to where we are, where it's warmer. But when I started planting grapes in the early to mid 90s, that was what every consultant, every winery was interested in Dijon clones. Mm-hmm. That was just what that was what was recommended at the time. And you know, this is how you learn and you evolve and you experiment and we figure things out. And after 25 years of growing grapes, we've found that it's just you know, some of the heritage clones do better. A lot of those were discovered here in California. That's one of the reasons they call them heritage, like the Swan clone or the Mount Eden clone, which is nicknamed also the Mary Edwards clone. You know, and some work and some don't, but that's just that's how it evolves, and how I'm sure they went through a lot of this stuff in other wine growing regions of the world. And we're still relatively young as far as you know, discovering where certain varietals work better than others in California.
So Nathan, you just asked if anybody had experience with the Mount Eden Ray clone. I mean, I've dealt with Mount Eden clone, but not anything specifically called Ray. Is that something different than what is Mount Eden normally?
Yeah, apparently it is, but I don't have a lot of info on that. UC Davis website actually has that kind of laid out, I believe. And I don't have any experience. Like, I have vines that are that tall right now.
Sure. I've dealt with Mount Eden at a number of places, but as I said, nothing specifically called Ray. And I think one of the things that's confusing for a lot of people is some of these clones, some of the particularly the heritage ones, have different names. So like Mount Eden is also 37. 23 is also Mariahfeld. And so they're known by two different names. So
Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
Well, as far as I think you initially were, one of the comments you made initially, Adam, was about, well, how important are clones? We talk a lot about clones, especially in Pinot Noir. But at the end of the day, I think at least on our vineyard, we found that site really does trump the clones. And I think we discovered that when we actually did, going back to the Pommard clone, we have 5 different sites of Pommard, and we ended up doing a Pommard clone blend starting in 2014 because of exactly this discussion we're having now. You and myself and Diane started discussing, because I think we had 3 or 4 different barrels or lots of Pommard, and we wanted to see how we compared how they taste. We were recognizing how different those different sites were that year. And then when we blended a couple of them together, it was different again. So it's the site really, because they're clones these are all the same clones, but and some of them are just a stone's throw away from each other, but the wines were different. And it was really a neat experiment going through that and doing that with you.
I do think that there are a number of things that maybe are more important than clones per se, as long as you've got a pretty good clone. I think site certainly trumps clone. I think farming. I mean, sorry, you can have the best clone in the world and the best site in the world too, but if you got really shitty farming, you're not on top of spray programs, that kind of thing. There's not much there that you can do about that. So I think I think those are things that will overwhelm certain clones. Kind of along those lines, and I guess, maybe Nathan and John, both of you can answer this. We've gone through a period of some drought over the last few years. As long as we're talking about clones and size and different properties, do you find that certain clones do better and survive drought better, or is that more of a rootstock issue than it is a clonal issue?
I mean, John, you're the farmer, but I do think that rootstock is maybe more important in our, pairing the right rootstock with the right soil seems to be the most important thing that I can do on my property.
I think rootstock is important during the drought. The other thing we saw last year, especially, the different styles of types of pruning, bilateral cordon versus cane pruning. If you think of the trunk coming up and having permanent arms with bilateral, and then having spurs, you have a lot more. There's a lot more to the plant that is retained and it's there year in, year out. And I think it could survive through the drought years better versus cane pruning. We saw more short shoots and more weak and fragile vines on our cane prune blocks versus our cordon prune blocks. And the cordon prunes seem to handle the drought these last 2 drought years better. But I do believe rootstock would also play into that also. That's what we saw in our vineyard.
I also look at heat spikes and things like that. And John, one of the clones that you have and that I've dealt with at a couple of places, other places, 943, It's one of the newest Dijon clones out there. 943 truly is different, I think, than the others. Not the others don't have differences, but this has got a larger difference because it's much smaller berries, smaller clusters, and a lot of times seedless berries. And that does not survive an extended heat spike well.
Yeah. I think that when the vine is stressed like that, it just is going to abort those seedless berries. We see that in shatter and everything else too. One thing that John brought up was as the mid 90s, that's about when I joined the wine industry, but it was on the Central Coast, the time that there was a lot of new planting going in and a lot of Dijon clones going in. And that was kind of coupled with improved canopy management and probably improved vineyard layout as well. And so I think a lot of the initial excitement for Dijon clones here might have been also just on the, tailing along with having controlled canopies and better light exposure and better ability to protect from from fungal disease. And I'm actually going back to some of the heritage clones in our newer plantings just to, and I think that as you're finding with Pommard, it has something to say if it's farmed very, very well, that is of interest. And I think that there's an advantage of both for sure.
So a couple of questions that have come up. One is asking about that how with certain grape types like Petite Syrah is often thought of as a blending grape, add some color, Alicante be the same kind of thing. Are some clones better suited in y'all's experience for blending rather than for designation by themselves or bottling by themselves? Nathan, any thoughts on that?
So clone 23, that's kind of a go-to for whole cluster fermentation for us, but I don't often find it to be a complete wine on its own in the way that some of the others can make very complete wines. But I think that there are some clones that seem to be very uniform. The Dijon clones seem to just, they'll be in a very tight level of ripeness generally if farmed well. And I don't see that as much with like 2A or Wadensville, which is favored down in our area. It seems to be a little bit more sporadic when it blooms.
I guess I would say it is interesting. You mentioned 2A, you mentioned which is Wadensville, and then 23 Mariafeld. I would toss Martini into this. Some of the older clones that have very thick skins, I don't find that they are anything. They can work well in blends, but I don't really see that they stand by themselves quite as well. If I were to just put a blanket statement, I'm sure there's some place in some wine that I look at and I'm like, oh crap, I'm wrong on this. I think actually down in your area, if I remember, either Rosemary's or Rincon for a while was all like Martini at one point in time or something like that. And I'm like, okay, here's the one that I will prove me wrong kind of thing.
Right. I think it was 2A, which
was
is really
2A?
favored. Okay. Yeah, really favored down here. And I don't think it's very well liked. It hasn't historically been super well liked in Russian River from what I understand.
No, in Oregon and in the San Luis Obispo kind of area, it works. To the point that I've heard some speculation that it's different there than it is. Who knows on that? But and so that kind of answered a little bit of question that Roger had, which is preferred clones for growers and producers in cooler areas or in certain areas where there's certain things that seem to work better or not. And we can get to that in a second. Jared Kelly asked a fairly technical question about, do separate clones create different levels of biogenic amines during fermentation? I'm unaware that certain ones necessarily would do that. But I guess it could be possible through thicker skins and the like, you might get more biogenic amines. I usually think that occurs more through stressed fermentations more than anything else. And that isn't necessarily tied into clones as much as it's tied into nutrient levels in the must. I don't know.
Yeah, and pH level, I think too. Like if you have high pH, you can allow more, negative microbes to create those.
Sure. Let's see. And so then, do you find, John? Let's go with you. And you kind of said this, and we're kind of wrapping up clones here, but do you find that in warmer years, say with 10 different clones, you have preferred certain clones? I mean, are you able to make that kind of broad statement? And in cooler years, you like these better? Anything like that goes along with it?
I think as far as the cooler years, and it's really more of a function as we get closer to harvest. It could be warm, so I'm talking about the last month of the growing season, like post veraison. If we get a warm weather leading up to harvest, that's where we see the bigger difference, where I think the Pommard clones really hold up better versus, say, the Dijon clones. And I think the heritage clones also, like the Mount Eden, they're just more adaptable. Swan, they seem to do okay. But to Nathan's point, also, like and the 943 is a Dijon. Sometimes with the Swan clone, we get those shot berries also, those small little those berries. It doesn't matter which clone, if we see it's more prevalent in something like the Dijon 943, because they're all relatively small, a lot of zero seed berries. But those shot berries, those small little berries with no seeds, they just won't hold up in the heat. So we protect those sites that we have where there are smaller Pinot berries. I think we had to do that one year. It was the first year we had the 943, Adam, in 2017, where it was really hot and it was the first year we had the 943, and it was a heat spike coming, and we pulled the trigger and picked that before we really had the optimal sugar level that we were after. But I think the wine, I think we really saved that lot that year. So there's different things like that obviously we learn to mitigate once we've worked with these different sites and try to pick Dijon a little bit earlier if we have to, versus a Pommard. We can let that ride a little bit.
And I guess this will be the last thing really on clones, and I'd like all of y'all's opinion a little bit, but I don't know that I can necessarily pinpoint a specific flavor to any specific clone. I mean, I think people sometimes look for that and look to say, oh, it's redder fruit, so it's this type of clone, it's that, this or that. But I would be wrong more than half the time if you had to like taste and have me guess what clone it is or isn't, because as I think we all said, site, farming, all of that can triumph and take over on some of that. Tony Lombardi is here, who makes some fantastic wines as well. Tony, do you have any thoughts on flavors specific to clones?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big proponent of site trumps clone. I always have been. And yet this kind of, not novelty, but this interest in learning and drilling down on the different clonal types of specifically Pinot Noir. But the sites in which, I've grown up around in terms of Petaluma Gap and Carneros, where there was a lot of, experimentation, certainly in the 70s and early 80s with the likes of Larry Hyde and Lee Hudson and just some great Mike Martini. I mean,
Francis,
just some great
Mahoney.
people. Francis Mahoney, yes. I mean, so, and I'm just a big fan of Dijon. I always have been. But the right mixing of some flavor and bass tones and creating an orchestra really of a complete wine where you have Pommard and Swan and even Calera when it makes sense. So, but for me, it's site, it's winemaking, but really it's the vineyard. that expresses the best things that reveal clones.
Cool.
The one thing, Adam, the last thing,
Yeah.
if you think about, I mean, one of the analogies we can use, and we can use multiple analogies. I agree with Tony. Site trumps, my experience, site trumps clones. But clones are really important because the different clones can add some. It's like when you're cooking and you're adding different spices to whatever you're preparing. That's my best analogy with the way we think of and the way we use clones in Pinot Noir, because there are ways of adding some different some layers and complexity from different sites and different clones, and it's just that's the way I think of it, like adding having different spices in your spice rack.
Makes sense. So from here, we're going to move on to a topic that winemakers seem to be all over the place on, and that is the use of whole cluster in fermentations, and whether or not, well, not so much whether or not it's a good thing, but what does it provide? What does it take away? What are the risks? What are the rewards? And it's certainly become a topic du jour. And so, Nathan, I know you said you've got a wine in front of you that you're drinking right now. That's one that you do that's about 80% whole cluster. And I think, John, you do as well. You've got the Opas, which is in that same kind of range. Nathan, what are your thoughts on whole cluster? How does that work for you?
Yeah, so there's two wines that we have. The center of effort is our kind of main estate bottling, usually about 20-ish% whole cluster fermentation. And then Rosso Corsa was something that was originally just for the owner and his friends, kind of his favorite barrels. He really loved the whole cluster style. And so that wine's always been 100% whole cluster. The problem, I think that whole cluster gives us our very favorite wines in the cellar, and it gives us our very biggest disappointments in the cellar. It's a little bit unpredictable for us. Our practice is generally to either do 100% whole cluster or else 100% cluster and very sorted. So we don't really do a lot in the middle of 20% add and so on. We like to get a good kind of carbonic start to the whole cluster process, and we find that falls apart if you have a lot of juice free. The fermentation will start real early, and what we get, I think that why we're always including a portion of whole cluster in our kind of prestige or our main estate wine is that in our region, if we do a complete sort, we end up with very kind of ripe, fruity, really fruit-driven, monotonal wines. And I think that great Pinot Noir should have, some herbal tones as well. Like there should be this kind of savory balance with the fruit. And for us, this is a way that we can bring that back. And we like to control that in the blending process, not in the fermenter generally. It's just to have a little bit more control over that. We also never use new French oak with a whole cluster fermented lot. We're always barreling down to, something that's pretty neutral.
Mm-hmm. John, whole cluster, I mean, you sell to a number of different wineries. I'm sure you see a number of wineries doing different things with your fruit.
Yeah, although that's true, but I don't really, I actually don't really get into the actual wine making. I know a couple of wineries will share that information. That's really, that's their prerogative. What we do discuss a lot of times when we, meet with wineries is talking about when we taste through some barrels and from the previous vintage and talk about things we can improve out in the vineyard. I don't really get into what their barrel program is or what they do percentage wise, but I know, for our own brand, I think it's been for me, it's been a really interesting process working with the 943 clone since, I just shared how our vineyard is driven by Pommard, but I'm fascinated by the 943, which is a Dijon clone. So it's just really interesting because it's so different. Small berries, not a lot of seeds, and I think the lack of seeds allows us to get away with a higher percentage of whole cluster fermentation because you get the tannins from the stem, and it's a fascinating clone to me, and I think it's really neat. I think you were able to. One of the reasons we planted that is I phoned you up once and said, hey, what about this? I know you've worked with it before. So that's the only information I could find online was an article that Adam was quoted in all the time. So I said, well, screw this, I'll just call him direct and talk to him. And so it was with your guidance, I think you knew a lot of the characteristics of this clone before working with it. I believe in Central Coast, you were working with it before.
I was, yeah, at Sierra Mar Vineyard in the San Lucia Highlands primarily.
Yeah. So anyway, it's I just think it's I really didn't understand and understood why we did whole cluster fermentation. There were some years we didn't do hardly any because we had some immature or uneven ripening, and we had a lot of green seeds in when we could take samples, and your recommendation was to back off on whole cluster, which made total sense. So since 2017, we've really we've kind of we've dove in with both feet with so to speak with the much higher whole cluster, which I find very interesting, and to Nathan's point, it gives you something completely different stylistically with Pinot Noir, which I find fascinating, and it just adds another component to the wines, which gives you again another layer of complexity or differences that include the site, include the rootstock, include the climate. So it's a fascinating world of experimenting with whole cluster or different percentages of whole cluster fermentation.
So we have a newer winemaker on here, Mauree Breeland, who's got her own label this year for the first time, although she's worked at wineries for 10 years or so. And Mauree, I know you did a couple of different lots, one with some stems and one without some stems. What do you see just in flavor profile differences between the two?
Yeah, hi. So before I pressed, trying those, and before going into barrel where they had the influence of the oak, the whole cluster, there wasn't much. It was about 10 to 15%, but it definitely had a earthier taste as well as a little bit more tannic grip on the tongue, where the 115 that was just whole berries, that one was just so much more fruit forward. It was fruit from the Russian River Valley. So it was just really bright with more of the strawberries, raspberries, red fruits. So definitely had a little difference even from that 10 to 15% whole cluster addition. But then now that it's in barrel and has gone into neutral and brand new and once used and different toasts and cooperages, I'm not going to say that the whole cluster is going to be the sole reason for the flavors that develop from that. But before going into barrel, there was a definite taste difference. It was exciting, lots to play with.
I know also, and one of the things that Nathan mentioned that kind of is interesting about the vineyard where you're kind of getting your fruit, it's out in the western edge of the Russian River, and there are a lot of conifer trees, things that will give you maybe a little bit more of some of that complexity, forest floor character, even in stuff that doesn't have whole cluster in it. So, I mean, it's almost like maybe in certain areas, it's not as necessary from a flavor point of view, because maybe you get it based just on the surroundings too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, because that's something you see. I mean, a lot of those surrounding that Lakeview vineyard. I will tell you that I've done whole cluster in a lot of places and a lot of varying amounts. from no whole cluster to 100%. And I'm now with my Clarice label in the San Lucia Highlands doing any place between 60 and up to about 80% whole cluster on these wines. It's interesting just to kind of tell y'all what whole cluster does. So basically you bring in the clusters, and instead of destimming them, you put them, I think usually in the bottom of the tank, although winemakers might do that slightly differently. And then you will destim and put fruit on top of that has been destemmed. And then it'll ferment in that way. And the clusters themselves will have almost some type of carbonic, I mean, almost fermentation within the cluster. The things that you'll notice is a number of differences. Tannin is something, because of the stems themselves, they'll have potentially a bit more tannin to the wine. Because of potassium in the stems, that will actually cause the pH to go up. So you'll have less strong acidity by doing whole cluster. You'll also find in many cases that when you're pressing, when your fermentation seems to be done, and then you're pressing, those last bunches will break open, and there's still some residual sugar in those. So that fermentation will then extend a bit longer in the barrel, and it'll actually ferment dry in barrel at that point in time. One of the reasons I've been doing whole cluster in the San Lucia Highlands on this new Clarice project has been that area comes in at very high levels of natural acidity, and having the acidity fall a bit is not necessarily a bad thing in those areas. It actually allows me to pick a little bit earlier there. A lot of times people in the San Lucia Highlands have waited to pick very, very late, so the acid goes down. By doing some whole cluster, it allows me to pick a bit earlier, and then yet still post malolactic fermentation end up with a good natural level of acidity in the wine. Nathan, you mentioned that you don't really like whole cluster and new oak, and yet for me, it seems to be working pretty well on these wines. What don't you like about them as much, about that combination?
It's probably more to do with like how we build up our final blends, that the character from the whole cluster, we kind of want that held separate from the oak. And we've actually had some pretty, I have my winemaker, Kevin Bargetto, who has been working with us for quite a while now. He's done some trials of 30% stem inclusion and some other things as well. And those iterations sometimes do really nicely in a newer barrel. So we have looked at that and admitted that they taste pretty great. So
I mean, it's one of those that I don't know that it's depending on the area, the age of the vines, on and on and on again, there can be a lot of different things that may or may not work. I think Lisa sent a text here earlier, posted something about there are no absolutes in wine. That's undoubtedly true when it comes to whole cluster. I have found that I don't love 100% whole cluster only because I like to get a little juice going. I'll find that if I don't have much juice, you will get potentially a little bit higher V8 levels by doing that. So I don't know, Nathan, when you do 100%, what do you do to break open the clusters then at some point?
Well, I mean, that is a danger, and we have had VA spike, and I think that when we try to keep the clusters protected and let them go carbonic, but once we can smell fermentation is active, it's the intern's favorite day, because then they get their shorts on and hop in and break down the clusters by foot. So we'll do that about 3 or 4 times before you can actually manipulate that the cap normally. We're doing this in
at Siduri, we always tried to hire one very big, very strong intern. Didn't necessarily have to be the brightest out of the intern group, but you needed the one guy that could either jump in like that or somehow make the punch downs work when you had a lot of whole, because punching down a vat that's 80% whole cluster, it's quite the workout.
Yeah, to say the least. We have a favorite tank for the whole cluster. It's an old It's an old dairy bulk tank that Mike Steiner actually found at one point, and we've it's insulated, it has like 4-inch thick walls. It does a really great job, and it's kind of that low, it's no deeper than maybe 4 feet. So it's perfect for that task.
And then do you find the same thing I do, where as you're pressing off, sometimes you'll get a little bump in sugar at the end? Is that something common for you there, Nathan, as well?
Yeah, for sure. Like the real challenges are you don't really know your starting chemistry very well because a lot of it's locked up in the berries. And then when you press off, you usually find that you still have several grams per liter of sugar residual. And it just changes our barrel down program. We let it settle a little bit longer in tank. We're usually like about a 24-hour to barrel, and with whole cluster, we'll give it some time to settle itself out a little bit more.
One of the things, there are two things that also I found really fascinating with using stems and doing a whole cluster. One of them is that I think, and someone had asked a question about this is why I'm going to say this, that they were saying that they didn't think that a cool climate would necessarily be the best place for a whole cluster, that you wanted to get ripeness. I actually find that a cool climate is exactly where you do want to do a whole cluster. That stem ripeness and fruit ripeness are very different, can be very different things. The two don't necessarily go hand in hand. And what you end up, the stem ripeness has to do with length of hang time as much. So the longer the grapes can hang on the vine, the more likely you are to get stem ripeness. So if you have a very hot year, and sugar spike very quickly, you get sugar really fast. Doing whole cluster on those, you may not have ripe stems, even though you got very high brix fruit. And so I find that those cooler seasons, cooler places that allow a long, cool growing season tend to be a better place to get stem ripeness. Nathan, make sense?
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong at all. And I think if it is a kind of controlled run up to harvest and things are pretty clean, that's like a good candidate for whole cluster fermentation. And I think John said earlier, like in some years, you tend away from that. And I can think to more problematic years for us where we have like really poor set. Like I think 2011, we had like an ice storm right during Pinot Noir set, and we're an all estate vineyard. So it kind of affected everything. The Pinot was all blooming right then. And we had enough kind of variation in ripeness within the cluster that we didn't really need to introduce more kind of green or herbal or those kind of brushy tones to the wine at all. We stayed completely away from whole cluster.
I had years up in Oregon where we had rot that would start actually more from the inside out, where you had, so it wasn't really easily sortable, maybe where you had every berry set and then berries in the inside of the cluster would break open and the rot would run up and down the stem. And so years like that, those were years where I really said, I mean, no, let's not do any whole cluster on that particular wine. So I do think there are times and occasions that you have to make adjustments in your whole cluster usage based on just the particular growing season conditions, that type of thing. And then the other thing that I have found is fascinating, and this was, I was getting fruit from the Hirsch vineyard out on Sonoma Coast, and there was a tasting that was put on out at Hirsch. And I shared a couple of sections with Lioco Winery, and they got basically the same sections as I did. And we both had done about 50% whole cluster. And yet their wine seemed so much more stemmy in a positive way, but it seemed like there was much more whole cluster usage in their 50% whole cluster than in mine. And one of the things that came up there was that while I fermented everything as one lot and it was all 50% whole cluster, they fermented one lot at 100% whole cluster, one lot at no whole cluster, and then blended them back together to get to the 50%. And so I have kind of become convinced that the percentage of whole cluster that you can read on a text sheet, a bigger question, or at least a question you should ask, is how did you get to that percentage? That it's kind of like more an earthquake scale, the seismic scale. The difference between a 4 and a 5 is 1, and the difference between a 5 and a 6 is 1, but it's actually increasing in magnitude as you go ahead. And so if you did 100% whole cluster and blended it with 0 to get 50%, that's going to show more whole cluster than someone who just did 50% across the board.
Interesting.
So that's kind of my experience there. Dave's asking if there are clones that are better for a whole cluster. I mean, John, you mentioned like 943 that we've done some of that with. What do you think on that?
Well, I think one of the things that I know that we've talked about over the years is just the maturity of the rachis, of the stem, and if you, some clones will, and some years you'll just have more. If you have a more less maturity on the stem or in the wood, so to speak, you could get a higher percentage of more of a vegetative type profile, or a greenness or a stemminess, however you want to describe it. And it's interesting, Nathan, you were talking about the 23 clone. We have a little bit of that on our place, and we have a very different. It's one of those, and I think Adam saw it first. It's really weird. It's one of the latest maturing Pinot clones for us. Almost one of the last ones we picked, and we rarely do whole cluster on that because the stems are so green. And it's so interesting to hear, like in your area, in the Central Coast, you actually, it's the opposite. And that I wonder if that's because the clone it grows differently in different areas. That's the part of clones and whole cluster that I find fascinating. That in Russian River Valley, where it's warmer, maybe we get the sugar before the stem maturity or the wood maturity. It's really interesting. So I think it varies, Adam. We've seen it year to year different because of like the uneven ripening. You have a higher percentage of greener seeds, less mature seeds. So we want to stay away from it. I think the Pommard clones seem to do okay. Is that your recollection in our vineyard?
Yeah, and actually my recommendation or recollection is that I have rarely screwed up Pommard by doing some whole cluster. That I think for some reason, maybe some of the Dijon clones, while they were picked to ripen faster in Burgundy, maybe that faster ripening doesn't allow for stem ripeness as well in our California climate. And things like Pommard, I think you can benefit from doing some whole cluster as well. Rick, I see you have jumped in here from CalStar Winery. How are you?
I'm good, other than running late today.
Not a problem. Talk a little bit about what you do or don't do. We talked about clones a good bit this to start it out, and we're now talking a little bit about whole cluster ferments. Do you do much at all on your wines?
I don't on mine. I've done them occasionally on clients' wines when I have ripe stems. And actually, the one time I had ripe stems was some Anderson Valley fruit on both 777 and 115. And I was able to do that year. There was enough fruit coming in. I was able to do side by side with one fermenter that had stem inclusion and one that didn't from each clone, and it was interesting down the road. And in the fermenter, I liked them both 777 and the 115 with stem inclusion better than the one without. And down the road, I like the 777 with the stem inclusion better than the lot that didn't have a stem inclusion. The 115, I actually wound up preferring the lot that didn't have stems in it.
Interesting. Yeah.
And my experience in general is if you don't have ripe stems, if your stems aren't really ripe, that from my palate at least, I get a green component I'm not fond of with stem inclusion.
And stems don't taste like something you'd want to put in your wine. And I always hope you can try this with Thompson seedless at home, but it's like biting into a banana peel a little bit or something when they're not entirely ripe.
Yeah, if I've got non-lignified stems, I don't care for them. Why would I want to put that in my wine?
One of the interesting things though is I think people were like, well, and if the stems taste good, and I'm like, I don't really ever find stems taste good per se. It's more though, like as a kid, while I was sitting underneath a tree, and sometimes you'd pick up a stick and put it in your mouth, and sometimes it was green and you like blech, and you twist it, but sometimes it would snap off, and it's more like a toothpick then or something along those lines, and it doesn't taste bad in those particular. I mean, a lot of kids chew on pencils, same kind of thing in some ways.
In the case of that one experience I had with where I had a lot of ripe stems, I literally came around the corner and they were destemming, and I was smelling cinnamon. So I was getting that, what I call a East Indian spice or garam masala effect in the stems, and it was like, okay, I want to stop destemming now.
Sure. It makes sense. And I think one of the fascinating things about this is consumers, I think, have the opportunity to get to know winemakers, get to know the wines, get to do these types of tastings, talk to people like this. I don't think there is a right answer here. There's a right answer for Rick or John or Mauree or Nathan based on their climate, based on what they're looking for in the wine, based on that. And the reason a lot of times I fall back on that, and I know it sounds kind of like a wimpy answer, but two of the most famous winemakers in all of Burgundy, Henri Jaillet, he hated whole cluster. No whole cluster, take everything off. And then you've got the Cess family at Dujac, and they're like 100% whole cluster. Let's go ahead and not destem anything. And I don't think any of us would necessarily turn down a glass or a bottle of either one of the wines there. So I don't know that there's anything wrong with each winery finding their own path at their own site.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, it's similar to, for me, the differentiation between different Cooper's barrels is also similar. It's like, there's some barrels work really well with one vineyard or one region's fruit and don't work well with another. And I think the same thing's true with whole cluster versus not whole cluster, although and it's all a matter of personal taste or lack thereof.
Steve, you asked a really good question, is how common is it for the grapes to be ripe and the stems not ripe or green? I think in California, in a lot of places, it's pretty common. And in certain years where we have heat spikes, jumps in heat, those warmer years, you can see sugars rise pretty quickly. And I don't think you necessarily find stem maturation happening at the same pace. So we're kind of reached the hour now. We've done the bit of clones, a bit of whole cluster. Any other questions from anybody along these kind of topics? And any thoughts? I mean, if you want to type something out in question on that, if we do this again, and I'll post a link to this video, but I would love to hear other topics, other things that people want to hear about. I like the fact that this group is called PinotGeeks, and that's what these type of topics appeal to. We're not we're not going around saying, you know, is this just red fruit or this, or it's so pretty. I mean, we're looking for some real kind of geeky conversations and some winemaker difference of opinions, not a problem here for all of us too. So please, you know, give us feedback. We'll post it. So Nathan, you're saying your stems rarely get completely lignified?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we see sort of like a golden kind of color at best would be about it, but never like, I actually think in Oregon, I remember seeing things get a little bit more browned in the stems when I worked up there.
I've seen it a couple of times in my life, but I mean, to completely lignified, no. But to me, it really is the difference of just like if it tastes noticeably green versus, and you just bite into some and it tastes again more like a toothpick or something like that. So that's it for the evening, everybody. Lisa, I saw your question about soils. That would be something I'd love to do next time, and we can talk about that as well. John, you'd be a good one to be involved in that too, as well, obviously. Thank you all to everybody for being here, for being part of this. Have a good evening, drink some Pinot, life's short, enjoy it. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.